I'm Margaret with Civic Nebraska's Voting Rights Team, and welcome to the Long March Forward for Voting Rights. Today we cover the complicated story of the struggle of Mexican Americans to secure their voting rights. We begin with the end of the Mexican-American War, which lasted from April 25, 1846 to February 3, 1848, when Mexico signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Under the treaty, Mexico conceded about 55% of its pre-war, pre-Texas territorial claims. The treaty added an additional 525,000 square miles to United States territory. The task of drawing the new border between the two countries would fall to two men who began work in October of 1849, Lieutenant Colonel John B. Weller and Surveyor Andrew Gray. The work was difficult, with few geographical references to mark the distinction between the two countries, and the two men frequently quarreled. This resulted in Weller assaulting Gray and Gray shooting Weller in the thigh. California voters will later judge this to be sufficient credentials for public office and elect Weller to serve both as U.S. Senator and Governor of California. Although the treaty provided assurance that the existing rights of Mexicans who owned property in what was now U.S. territory would be honored, that was not always the case. For instance, land grant disputes in New Mexico remain ongoing 172 years later. We cannot understand the history of voting barriers for Latinx and Hispanic voters without a basic understanding of the impact immigration policy has on voting rights. For most of the 19th century, the U.S. has virtually open borders with its neighbor to the south, allowing people to move freely between the two countries. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo gave Mexicans residing in the newly acquired American territory the choice to remain Mexican citizens or to become U.S. citizens. Over 90% chose American citizenship. This is not surprising. To not do so would have meant relinquishing their property rights. It's estimated the U.S. gained between 75 to 100,000 new citizens. Voting rights were extended to males over the age of 21. Yet, when exercising their voting rights, people of Mexican descent faced prejudice, intimidation, and violence. In 1975, La Raza Unida Party, the United People's Party, a Chicano nationalist third party, testified before Congress prior to the extension of the Voting Rights Act. They cited numerous examples of voter intimidation and suppression. This included gerrymandering districts to dilute the power of the Chicano vote, throwing out ballots of people who could not write their names, and the beating of La Raza Unida Party member Modesto Rodriguez. On August 17, 1975, President Ford signed the Voting Rights Extension Act as a result of their testimony, and Congress added protections that required jurisdictions to provide translated materials to facilitate voter registration and participation. Since 2010, Latinx voters have increasingly faced voter suppression, particularly in the form of strict voter ID requirements. In the 2016 election, 9% of Latinx respondents polled say they or someone in their household were told they lacked the proper identification to vote. Only 3% of white voters responded to the same issue. With me today to talk about the importance of voting is Lupita Ayala Montanez, who is a client advocate and Department of Justice accredited representative with the Multicultural Coalition in Grand Island. Lupita, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Can you tell us, what does voting mean to you?
Hi, Margaret. Actually, fun fact, I'm not a U.S. citizen yet, but hopefully, like we say in my family, si Dios quiere, which means God willing, I will be participating in the next elections. Voting for me is so important because I come from a country where there's a lot of corruption. So it's normal to see people selling their vote for like 500, 600 pesos. And as a child, you start to grow up with that mentality that voting doesn't really matter because at the end of the day, whoever has the most power or the most money is gonna get the election, right? That mentality changed when I moved to the United States because I was participating with a nonprofit canvassing for the 2018 elections. I was knocking on doors and talking to people about elections and how things work here in the United States. And it made me realize how important voting was, right? I was asking people what they wanted, like what their needs were, what their struggles. And the United States is a country so diverse that not only like on the color of our skin or like the country of origin, but also the way we see the world and our struggles. My struggles might be different than my representatives. They say your vote is your voice. And it's so true because by voting, that's how we let or representatives know what the community actually needs.
So when you talk to your family about voting, what sort of things do you talk about?
I ask my family, are you registered to vote? Also, I try to make elections and voting interested to them. So I ask my aunts or my cousins, what matters to you, what's important. For example, my aunt has children, right? So I asked her, is education for your children important, and how important is to choose a representative that also cares for the education of our kids, right? Fun fact, my mom just became a U.S. citizen, and as she come out of the USCIS office, I told her, you know, you can vote right now, right? Like, now you can register to vote. So yeah, I try to bring that education that I didn't receive in my country to my family now, because they might have the same perspective that I had before about elections. So yeah.
Thank you for sharing your perspective, Lupita.
Thank you.
In Nebraska, counties with 5% of voters listing Spanish as their first language, election officials are required to provide voting information in Spanish. Only 3 counties in Nebraska are currently required to do so. They are Colfax, Dakota, and Dawson. One way you can ensure compliance on providing election materials in Spanish is to become an election observer with our election protection team. To get involved, visit civicnebraska.org or scan the QR code. You too can join the Long March Forward for Voting Rights.